Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the International Relations Podcast. I'm your host, Almi Troquart, and this week we're diving into a highly requested expose on Professor William Schlickenmeyer's Gov 1600 course. We'll be tackling the much-anticipated question, do we really need to study all these weeks of topics to understand IR, or is there a hidden shortcut within the syllabus? Throughout this podcast, we'll take a realist perspective, adopting a broad rationalist lens to explore topics like peace, cooperation, conflict, and even neocolonialism. Let's get started. As we know, international relations is an intrinsically diverse field, tasked with the complex challenge of analyzing, mediating, and predicting both intra- and interstate actions. In the 21st century, however, one domain has emerged as the central framework for understanding and forecasting international relations: economic relations. Compared to other key areas such as war and peace, law and agreement, race and gender, class and nation, transnational challenges, and empire and hegemony, economic relations stand out as the most pivotal. This field not only explains why states have acted in particular ways historically, but also provides the clearest insights into how they are likely to behave in the future. By focusing on economic relations, one can address the fundamental questions at the heart of international relations. Will states remain neutral? Will they form alliances? Or will they become adversaries? Economic relations offer a comprehensive rationale for phenomena such as alliances, conflict, isolationism, and protectionism, making it the cornerstone of the discipline in the modernizing world. First, let's cover alliances. Economic policies are a primary factor in understanding why states engage with one another, particularly in forming alliances. In a continuously modernizing world where power is defined by resources, a strong economy is essential for solidifying a nation's place as a global power and attracting alliances with other influential countries. Helen Milner writes in International Trade that the security externalities of trade will drive countries' behavior, inducing them to help their allies while also punishing their enemies. This can be observed in the United States' relationship with Japan following World War II. Through initiatives like the 1951 Security Treaty and subsequent economic agreements, the U.S. supported Japan's post-war reconstruction and integrated its economy into global markets, fostering independence. By building this economic partnership, the U.S. not only solidified Japan as an ally during the Cold War, but also mitigated the risk of future conflict through mutual economic reliance and shared prosperity. What exactly do states do to ensure this allyship? Well, let's talk about interdependence. Economic interdependence is one of the most effective deterrents to conflict as it fosters cooperation and shared interests between states. This may sound wonderful, but further study shows the truth behind this neo-colonialist strategy. Larger economies often use their influence to impose ideologies on smaller economies, creating interdependence that ensures access to critical resources while reducing the likelihood of hostility. Michael Toms addresses this in International Finance, stating, "A smaller section of literature has examined the casual role of the U.S. and other developed countries as the leading economic power in the world. The U.S. has a hegemonic interest in capital liberalization. It benefits when other countries use the dollar as a reserve currency and when U.S. citizens and firms can invest freely. This dynamic underscores how economic interdependence not only maintains global stability, but also reinforces the dominance of leading powers. It is this reliance on interconnected economies that informs key areas of IR, including hegemony, negotiations, and even neocolonialism." Now we come to the flip side of the discourse, which is conflict. When systems of interdependence, deterrence, and alliance fail, conflict often emerges, frequently centered on economic power and resource control. In the 21st century, conflicts are predominantly driven by disputes over vital resources such as land, oil, and natural gas. In International Political Economy, Benjamin J. Cohen highlights how complex economic interdependence implied a widening control gap between state aspirations and state capabilities, meaning that by the post-World War II period, economic relations had extended beyond the sovereignty of individual states to become a global force of their own. This widening gap has led to both intrastate conflicts over resource distribution and interstate wars over territorial claims. The ongoing conflicts between Israel and Palestine and between Russia and Ukraine exemplify this phenomenon. While both conflicts are framed by political and historical narratives, their roots actually lie in competition over land, oil, and natural gas. These disputes highlight how economic relations are deeply embedded in the causes and consequences of modern warfare and affect the whole world, especially in terms of fuel prices and foreign aid. Well then, you may ask, what are states' actions surrounding conflict? This question brings us to isolationism. One response to precarious economic relations is isolationism, which seeks to minimize external connections and centralize economic functions within a nation. According to rationalist theory, isolationism is a logical strategy to avoid conflict. However, realism challenges this notion, arguing that it often leads to intrastate tension over production and prices. Cohen addresses this idea from the perspective of the state, citing Robert K. Hohn's claim that in a world without centralized government, why should states comply with obligations that had become inconvenient? This illustrates the dangers of isolationism, as unchecked state power without others balancing against it can lead to exploitative policies and economic inefficiencies, ultimately fueling internal unrest. Cohen also cites Stephen Krasner's association that once regimes are established, they assume a life of their own, which follows this logic, suggesting that isolationism can paradoxically invite external intervention when other states or international organizations step in to check a regime's absolute power. These dynamics further emphasize the centrality of economic relations in understanding state behavior and decision-making. Are there any other actions, you may wonder? The answer is yes, protectionism. Protectionism is another key aspect of economic relations that shapes state interactions in international relations. Helen Milner explores this concept, noting that advanced industrial countries with low-skill, labor-intensive industries with high and rising import penetration are frequently associated with high protection, showing that trade liberalization often conflicts with domestic economic priorities. She further explains that export-oriented industries and multinationals tend to favor freer trade and be associated with less protection, demonstrating how powerful economies dominate the free trade system, increasing interdependence and reducing the likelihood of conflict. Milner concludes by highlighting how anti-protectionist movements have contributed to the global shift towards trade liberalization, underscoring the role of economic relations in fostering international stability and defining global hegemony. Now that we have covered peace and conflict and how economic relations dictate all of these movements, let's conclude. In conclusion, by adopting a realist rationalist approach, it becomes evident that international relations can be analyzed through an economic lens, as nearly all inter- and intrastate interactions revolve around resources and economic power in today's modernized world. Economic relations provide the clearest rationale for alliances, interdependence, conflicts, and policies like isolationism and protectionism, making them the cornerstone of understanding global interactions in the 21st century. Wait, what about the other topics covered in the duration of the course? Don't they matter? Well, yes, but not as much as economic relations. Let's break it down. As we've just discussed, economic relations are the paramount framework for understanding and predicting international relations, especially through a rationalist or realist lens. Since peace and conflict are central to the pragmatic applications of IR, economic relations provide the clearest rationale for state behavior. So, what about war and peace? In truth, war and peace in the modern world are deeply entwined with economic relations. The pursuit of economic power dominates peace, just as nations with that power dominate the world stage. Countries are far less likely to engage militarily with nations where they have significant economic stakes or trade ties. Conversely, they are highly likely to ignite conflicts over resources they deem critical or feel entitled to, like in our earlier examples of Israel-Palestine and Russia-Ukraine. Essentially, the study of war and peace cannot be separated from economic relations, making economics the more pivotal field of analysis. But what about law and agreement? Similarly, international laws and agreements in the modern era are largely shaped by the pursuit and practice of economic relations. Negotiations almost always revolve around economics and resources. Larger nations frequently exercise economic power over smaller ones, using tools like tariffs and embargoes to secure their interests. For instance, in the 1990s, the U.S. imposed an embargo on Haiti, plunging the nation into deeper economic hardship. Despite being a democracy, Haiti became vulnerable to political instability and violence, exacerbated by pressures from dominant democracies like the U.S. Another example is the influence of multinational corporations, whose economic clout often surpassed that of nation-states. With only 22 countries being wealthier than Walmart, corporations are increasingly difficult to contain within national laws. This outsized influence shows that economic power frequently overrides legal frameworks, underscoring the importance of studying economic relations over law and agreement. But what about race and gender? Well, race and gender are important considerations in IR, but they do not encompass the global scale of action seen today. Within states, socioeconomic status often supersedes race as a determinant of quality of life. A poor white person and a poor non-white person have more in common than a wealthy non-white person and a poor non-white person. While historical trends may link race and poverty, poverty itself is not discriminatory, and correlation is not causation. Similarly, when it comes to gender, current feminist advocacy often focuses on economic equality, such as the fight for equal pay. In both cases, socioeconomic factors dictate living conditions and representation on the global stage. This further supports the idea that economic relations are more central to IR than race and gender. What about class and nation? The discourse on class and nation is inextricably linked to economic relations. Nationalism, often thought to override other allegiances, is heavily influenced by economic power. For example, while China has made remarkable progress in reducing poverty, it remains a surveillance state, prioritizing economic status over individual freedoms. Marxist critiques, similarly, hinge on the economic determinism of capitalism. Writers from the Frankfurt School, for example, focused on how variations in economic policies could shift political culture. This demonstrates that class and nation as concepts rely entirely on the economic framework for their analysis and relevance in IR. But what about transnational challenges? Globalization, the hallmark of transnational challenges, is driven by almost entirely economic forces. As Colin Hay notes in IR Theory and Globalization, the process of economic globalization has enhanced the power of capital relative to the state, with the effect that whole areas of domestic policymaking have essentially been depoliticized. This means economic forces now shape global politics more than traditional state policies do. Another major transnational challenge, environmental degradation, highlights this dominance of economic relations. Green theory often fails to halt modernization and economic growth, which continue to drive environmental destruction. This demonstrates that even in transnational challenges, economic relations are the central force at play. But what about empire and hegemony? Finally, let's consider empire and hegemony. As David Lake writes in Great Power Hierarchies and Strategies in the 21st Century World Politics, the hegemon might be coercive, using its superior power resources to impose its preferred order on others, or benevolent, creating an order that benefited not only itself but others as well. In either case, economic resources determine who the hegemon is and dictate the actions they take to stabilize their positions. In the realm of post-colonialism, economic relations have become a modern form of neocolonialism. Institutions like the World Bank and IMF are often criticized for conditioning loans to smaller nations in ways that trap them in economic subservience to the West. This use of economic leverage underscores how empire and hegemony rely fundamentally, again, on economic power, making economic relations indispensable to their study. Now, we're really done. Economic relations are not merely a facet of IR, they are its foundation. From war and peace to empire and hegemony, every domain within international relations hinges on the dynamics of economic power. This solidifies its position as the most important framework for understanding the complexities of our modern interconnected world. Thank you.